The stone cutting started on March 14, 1891, and by noon, the temperature had already climbed to 87 degrees in the shade. By evening, word had spread through Mineral Springs, Arizona territory that the Harlan girl, the one old Samuel Harlan had thrown out of his house 3 days prior for refusing to marry the Comstock boy, had staked a claim on 4 acres of worthless scrubland at the base of Copper Ridge and was cutting sandstone blocks from an exposed outcropping with nothing but a borrowed hammer, a worn chisel, and what the townspeople could only describe as dangerous obstinacy. Martha Harlan was 18 years old, had $11.40 to her name, and had decided that if she was going to survive the coming summer without a family, without prospects, and without the protection of any man's roof, she would need to build something the territory had never seen before. The neighbors who rode past that first week saw a young woman in a faded cotton dress, her auburn hair tied back with twine, systematically scoring lines into sandstone and breaking free blocks that measured exactly 18 inches by 12 inches by 8 inches deep. They saw sweat running down her face in the March heat. They saw her hands already blistered and bleeding. What they did not see, what they could not possibly have understood, was that Martha Harlan had spent every summer of her childhood in her grandfather's stone spring house in the hill country of Texas, a structure built by German immigrants in 1849. And she had noticed something that her father, her brothers, Shing and every man in Mineral Springs had apparently failed to observe. On the hottest days of August, when the air outside shimmered at 108 degrees and horses stood motionless in whatever shade they could find, the inside of that spring house held steady at 68 degrees without ice, without water circulation, without any mechanical intervention whatsoever. The walls were 22 inches thick. The windows were small and positioned high. The floor was dug 3 feet below grade. And Martha Harlan, at age 11, had asked her grandfather why, and he had explained the physics in words a child could understand. Now, 7 years later, with nothing left but the knowledge in her head and the strength in her arms, she intended to build herself that same kind of shelter. And she calculated she could do it for $300 if she cut every stone herself, hauled her own materials, and worked 16 hours a day for the next 4 months. The townspeople thought she had lost her mind. They were not entirely wrong about the desperation, but they were catastrophically wrong about everything else. Thomas Reedy was the first to voice what everyone else was thinking. Reedy owned the general store on Main Street and had been selling supplies to settlers in Mineral Springs for 11 years, long enough to watch dozens of optimistic newcomers build homes that cracked in the heat, warped in the monsoon rains, and sometimes simply collapsed under their own structural failures. He was 53 years old, a practical man who prided himself on giving practical advice. And on March 19th, he rode his mule out to the Harlan claim to have a conversation he considered a civic duty. He found Martha sitting on a pile of cut stones, eating a biscuit and studying a piece of paper covered with diagrams and calculations. The site was already transformed. She had cleared the brush, dug out a rectangular foundation 18 feet by 14 feet that went down 32 inches into the hardpan and stacked approximately 60 finished stone blocks in neat rows sorted by size. Reedy dismounted and spent a full minute walking around the excavation before he spoke. "Miss Harlan," he said finally, "I knew your grandfather before he passed, and I have a certain respect for your family despite your father's recent decisions. So I am going to speak plainly. What you are attempting here will not work. Gneiss stone construction requires mortar, and mortar requires lime, and lime costs money you do not have. Stone walls require foundations that go below the frost line, and Arizona does not freeze, so you might think that does not matter, but it does. The ground heats and shifts and cracks, stone the same as frost does, just slower. And even if you solve both of those problems, a stone building in this territory will absorb heat all day and radiate it all night, turning your cabin into an oven that will cook you alive by July. I have seen it happen. I have buried people it happened to. Frame construction with proper ventilation is what works here. That is what everyone builds because that is what functions." Martha listened without interrupting, then folded her paper and tucked it into her pocket. "Mr. Reedy, I appreciate your concern, but I am not building what everyone builds. I am building what my grandfather built in Texas, modified for this climate. The walls will be 20 inches thick at the base and 18 at the top, using a rubble core with cut-face exterior. The mortar will be caliche mud mixed with cactus juice and ash, which sets harder than Portland cement in dry heat. That is a technique the Pueblo people have used for 800 years, and it costs nothing except labor. The foundation is below grade specifically to access cooler soil temperatures. At 30 inches down, the ground here holds steady at 61 degrees year-round, which I verified by digging test holes and measuring with a soil thermometer borrowed from the surveyor's office. Well, the walls will not radiate heat inward because they will still be absorbing the day's heat when the sun goes down, and they will not finish releasing that heat until mid-morning, by which time they will have begun absorbing the next day's heat. The thermal mass works as a buffer, not an amplifier. The windows will be small, deeply recessed, and positioned only on the north and east walls, with none facing south or west. There will be a ventilation shaft in the roof that creates convective airflow once interior temperature exceeds exterior by more than 3 degrees. She paused. I have done the calculations. They work. Reedy stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. You have your grandfather's stubbornness. I will give you that much. But calculations on paper do not survive contact with an Arizona summer. I hope you are still alive in September to learn that lesson. He mounted his mule and rode back toward town without looking back. Martha Harlan watched him go, then picked up her hammer and chisel and went back to cutting stone. She had 2,847 more blocks to cut, and summer was 4 months away. If you find value in these stories of forgotten practical wisdom and want to help preserve them, I would ask you to consider subscribing to this channel. The button is there. The cost is nothing, and every subscription helps ensure these accounts of ordinary people solving extraordinary problems continue to reach those who might need them. These are not tales I invent. They are histories I recover, and they deserve to be remembered. By the end of March, Martha had cut over 400 blocks and begun laying the first course of her foundation walls. The technique she used was one her grandfather had described, but she had never seen performed. She laid each stone dry, wiggled it to find its natural seating, then lifted it and applied a half-inch layer of her caliche mortar before setting it permanently. The mortar was a mixture she had developed through 17 separate test batches: 3 parts caliche clay, 1 part fine sand, 1/4 part wood ash, and enough prickly pear juice to give it the consistency of thick cream. The prickly pear she harvested from stands growing wild along the ridge, boiling the pads to extract their mucilaginous liquid, which acted as a binding agent and plasticizer. Each batch made enough mortar for approximately 30 stones. Each stone weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, and each day, working alone, she managed to cut, haul, mortar, and set between 18 and 24 blocks depending on conditions. The mathematics were simple. At that pace, she would complete the walls by mid-July, which gave her 3 weeks of margin before the worst heat of August. It was not comfortable, it was not certain, but it was possible. Word of her progress reached town through the occasional writer who passed her claim, and by April, the skepticism had evolved from dismissive to actively hostile. Edith Comstock, mother of the young man Martha had refused to marry, was heard in the Mercantile declaring that the Harlan girl was making a spectacle of herself, living alone like an animal, and building a monument to her own prideful foolishness that would stand as a warning to other young women who thought they knew better than their elders. Jacob Fry, who ran the livery stable and considered himself an expert on construction because he had once helped build a barn in Kansas, rode out on April 8th specifically to inspect her work and returned with a detailed critique. The stones were too irregular. The mortar joints were too thick in places and too thin in others. The walls were going up crooked because she had no proper plumb line, and the whole structure would crack apart in the first hard rain, because caliche was not real mortar, and everyone knew that. He delivered this assessment to anyone who would listen, and most of the town listened. Because there was not much entertainment in Mineral Springs, and watching someone fail was at least something to discuss. What Jacob Fry did not mention, perhaps because he did not notice, or perhaps because it did not fit his narrative, was that Martha's walls were not going up crooked. She had constructed a plumb line from a sock filled with sand suspended from a tripod of ocotillo branches, and she checked every third course against it. The variation across her entire first 7 courses was less than half an inch, which was well within acceptable tolerance. She did not bother correcting Fry's assessment. She did not have time for corrections. She had stones to cut. April brought the first test of her concepts, though not the test she had anticipated. On April 23rd, A windstorm swept through this territory with gusts measured at 47 miles per hour at the weather station in Tucson, 90 miles to the south. The wind carried sand and debris that stripped paint from buildings, shattered windows, and collapsed the tent where Martha had been sleeping since her eviction. When she emerged from the rubble of canvas and poles the next morning, she found her partially completed walls standing exactly as she had left them. The mortar joints intact, the stones unmoved. 3 frame buildings in town had lost roofing. The Methodist church had lost its steeple. But her 18-inch thick stone walls, now standing 4 feet high, had simply ignored the wind entirely. This was not vindication. The walls were not yet complete, the roof was not on, and summer had not arrived to test her thermal calculations. But it was data. It was evidence that her methods produced structural stability in conditions that challenged conventional construction. She noted the observation in the small journal she kept, recording wind speed, damage assessments, and the performance of her walls. Then, she dug her tent out of the sand, re-erected it with reinforced stakes, and went back to cutting stone. The next morning, Mrs. Delacroix, a widow who ran the boarding house on the east side of town, rode out with a basket containing fresh bread, salt pork, and 2 jars of preserved peaches. She said nothing about why she had come, asked no questions about the construction, and stayed only long enough to leave the basket on Martha's completed wall section before riding away. It was the first kindness anyone from Mineral Springs had shown her in 6 weeks. Martha ate the peaches that night and saved the jars to store nails. By May 15th, the walls stood at their full height of 8 feet, ready for the roof structure, and Martha Harlan had spent exactly $217 of her $300 budget. The spending broke down with precision she recorded in her journal: $11 for the hammer, chisels, and replacement handles when the originals broke, $43 for timber, 12 oak beams hauled from the mountains north of Phoenix, each 12 feet long and 8 inches square, for the roof structure, $61 for the roofing materials themselves, a combination of wooden planks and sheets of tin she had purchased at discount from a warehouse in Tucson that was liquidating water-damaged stock. The tin was not water-damaged. It had simply been stored next to merchandise that was. $38 for the doors and window frames, purchased secondhand from a building in Florence that was being demolished. $19 for glass, nails, hinges, and hardware. $45 for food, water transport, and incidentals over 13 weeks of construction. The remaining $83 was reserved for contingencies and survival through summer. The total expenditure for the structure itself, not including her labor, was $217 for an 848-square-foot building with 20-inch stone walls, a ventilated roof with 3 inches of air gap between the tin and the interior ceiling, a floor dug 32 inches below grade, and 3 windows totaling less than 8 square feet of glazing, in all positioned to receive no direct sunlight during the summer months. By comparison, a standard frame cabin of similar size would cost between $400 and $500 in materials alone, would require purchased labor for construction, and would offer no thermal mass whatsoever. The mathematics, as Martha's grandfather had often said, were not complicated. They were merely ignored by people who did not believe them. The roof went up in 11 days with help from an unexpected source, Diego Miramontes, a mason from Sonora who had heard about the stone building from travelers passing through and rode 40 miles to see it for himself. He was 62 years old, had built stone structures in Mexico for 4 decades, and upon examining Martha's walls had declared them not perfect, but honest work that would outlast everyone who criticized it. He stayed for 11 days, sleeping in her tent while she slept under the stars, and taught her techniques for setting the roof beams, sealing the joints, and creating the thermal chimney in the roof peak that would draw hot air upward and out of the structure. He refused payment. When he left, he told her that his grandmother had built a stone house during the French intervention when the men were away fighting, and that she had lived in it for 53 years until her death. "The stones do not care who sets them," he said. "They only care that they are set correctly. You set them correctly." Then he rode south, and Martha never saw him again. If this story of practical ingenuity resonates with you, if you believe these examples of adaptive thinking and forgotten wisdom deserve preservation, I would ask you to share this with someone who might benefit from it. The algorithms that govern what people see are driven by engagement, And every comment, every share, every moment of watch time helps ensure these histories reach beyond those who already know to seek them out. This is how knowledge spreads in any era. One person tells another, and the telling continues until what was forgotten becomes remembered again. June arrived with temperatures that reminded everyone why sensible people questioned the sanity of living in Arizona territory at all. The first week averaged 101 degrees in the shade. The second week climbed to 104. By June 20th, on the thermometer at Reedy's General Store, the unofficial official temperature of Mineral Springs had reached 109 degrees, and 4 horses had died of heat exhaustion despite access to water troughs. The frame buildings in town became uninhabitable during daylight hours. People retreated to root cellars, sat in the shade of the single cottonwood tree that somehow survived in the town center, or simply endured with wet cloths on their necks and the grim knowledge that July and August would be worse. Martha Harlan's stone cabin stood complete at the base of Copper Ridge, and on June 20th, when the outside temperature reached 109 degrees at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she placed her grandfather's brass thermometer on a shelf in the exact center of her main room and watched it hold steady at 71 degrees. She had prepared for this. She had understood theoretically that it would work, but theory and experience are different countries, and walking from the brutal hammer of the afternoon sun into air that felt like spring was an experience that made her sit down on her packed earth floor and simply breathe for several minutes. The walls were cool to the touch, not cold, but noticeably cooler than her own skin. The floor, 32 inches below grade, was cooler still. The air circulated gently, rising toward the thermal chimney in the roof peak and drawing replacement air through the small screened vents she had positioned at floor level on the north wall. The system worked exactly as her grandfather had described, exactly as the physics predicted, and exactly as every person in Mineral Springs had insisted it would not. She did not announce her success. And she did not ride into town to correct the opinions of Thomas Reedy or Jacob Fry or Edith Comstock. She simply lived in her cabin, emerging in the early mornings and late evenings to tend her small garden, which was itself shaded by a ramada of her own construction and watered by a system of clay ollas buried in the soil to minimize evaporation, and waiting to see what the summer would bring. What the summer brought in the third week of July was fire. The Copper Ridge Fire started on July 18, 1891, ignited by lightning during a dry thunderstorm that brought electricity but no rain. The initial strike landed in a stand of dead juniper approximately 4 miles northeast of Mineral Springs, and the fire spread southwest. Driven by winds that gusted to 35 miles per hour and fed by vegetation that had not seen significant rainfall since the previous October. By the morning of July 19th, the fire had consumed approximately 2,800 acres and was advancing on the town at a rate that the territorial fire warden later calculated at 1.2 miles per hour. The evacuation order came at 11 a.m. Most residents of Mineral Springs loaded what they could onto wagons and fled south toward Tucson, reasoning that a frame town in the path of a wildfire was not a place to make a stand. The temperature that day was 105 degrees before the fire arrived. Martha Harlan did not evacuate. Her cabin sat at the western edge of the fire's projected path, so close enough that she could see the wall of smoke advancing, but positioned in an area of sparse vegetation that offered less fuel than the juniper stands to the north. More importantly, her cabin was stone. Stone does not burn. Stone walls 20 inches thick do not transmit enough heat to ignite interior materials unless exposed to flame for hours. And the fire, moving at 1.2 miles per hour across a front approximately 3 miles wide, would pass any given point in less than 40 minutes. She had calculated the odds, she had evaluated the risks, and she had decided that her $300 investment in permanent shelter was worth defending with her presence, if only to wet down the wooden roof structure and prevent embers from finding purchase. The fire reached her property at 4:47 p.m. on July 19, 1891. She recorded the time in her journal, along with the temperature, 111 degrees, without accounting for radiant heat from the flames, and the wind direction, southwest at approximately 25 miles per hour sustained. She had spent the previous 4 hours soaking her roof with water hauled from the spring that gave the town its name, approximately 200 gallons carried in buckets over a distance of 340 yards, and she had cleared all vegetation within 30 feet of her walls. When the fire came, she stood inside her cabin with the door closed, the vents blocked with wet cloth, and a bucket of water ready to extinguish any embers that made it through the gaps in her construction. The roar of the fire was audible even through 20 inches of stone, so a sound like standing next to a massive waterfall combined with the cracking of wood and the occasional pop of superheated sap. The interior of the cabin, which had been holding at 71 degrees, began to warm, slowly, far more slowly than she had expected, but measurably. At 5:15 p.m., the thermometer read 73 degrees. At 5:30 p.m., with the fire now past her immediate position but still burning to the southwest, it read 74 degrees. At 6 p.m., as the immediate threat receded and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, it read 75 degrees and had stopped climbing. The stone walls had absorbed the radiant heat of the fire, the superheated air, the thermal assault of an inferno that had sent the town of Mineral Springs fleeing for their lives, and they had transmitted an increase of 4 degrees to the interior space. Outside, the world smelled of ash and smoke and the particular chemical sharpness of burned creosote bush. The sparse vegetation that had surrounded her claim was gone, replaced by charred earth and the skeletal remains of scorched shrubs. But her cabin stood, her garden, protected by the ramada and the careful clearing she had maintained, was damaged but not destroyed, and she was alive, unburned, unharmed, and suddenly in possession of the only intact structure within 3 miles of town center. The residents of Mineral Springs began returning on July 21st, after the fire had burned itself out against a rocky escarpment to the southwest, and the territorial authorities had declared the area safe for re-entry. What they returned to was devastation. 17 of the 23 buildings in town proper had been destroyed, whilst including the Methodist Church, the livery stable, 4 of the 6 saloons, and the entire row of frame houses on the north side of Main Street. The general store had survived only because Thomas Reedy had organized a bucket brigade to wet down the roof before evacuating, and even then the heat had warped the windows and cracked the exterior paint. 3 residents had died. William Forrest, age 67, who had refused to evacuate and was found in the charred remains of his frame cabin, apparently overcome by smoke before the flames reached him. Eleanor Fry, wife of Jacob Fry, who had suffered a heart attack during the evacuation and died on the road to Tucson, and an infant, Thomas Beach Jr., 3 months old, who had succumbed to heat exposure during the evacuation despite his parents' desperate efforts to keep him cool with wet cloths. The survivors returned to find their homes destroyed, their possessions reduced to ash, and their assumptions about building and survival in Arizona territory fundamentally challenged by one inescapable fact. The only building that had emerged from the fire completely undamaged was the stone cabin on the Harlan claim, built by a girl of 18 who had been told by every experienced person in the territory that her methods would not work. Thomas Reedy was among the first to ride out to the Harlan claim after the fire. He did not bring advice this time. He brought a wagon loaded with provisions, flour, salt, coffee, 2 bolts of fabric, and a rocking chair that had been his wife's before she died in the influenza outbreak of 1887. He pulled the wagon up to Martha's cabin, climbed down, and stood for a long moment looking at the stone walls, the undamaged roof, the intact windows, the garden that was already showing signs of recovery from the heat stress. Martha emerged from the cabin and stood on her threshold, waiting. "Miss Harlan," Reedy said finally, "I owe you an apology. I told you that calculations on paper do not survive contact with an Arizona summer. I was wrong. Your calculations survived contact with an Arizona summer and an Arizona fire." He paused. "I have spent the last 2 days helping bury William Forrest, who died in a frame cabin because that is what everyone builds here, because that is what we all believed would work. Oh, and now I am standing in front of a stone cabin that held through a fire that destroyed half my town, and I am asking myself how many people would still be alive if we had listened to an 18-year-old girl who actually understood how heat moves through materials." He gestured at the wagon. "These are not payment. You cannot pay for being wrong about something that cost lives. but they are what I have, and I would be grateful if you would accept them." Martha walked to the wagon and looked at the provisions. The rocking chair was walnut, beautifully made, completely out of place in a frontier cabin, but clearly precious to the man who had brought it. "I will accept them, Mr. Reedy, and I will answer any questions you have about how I built this structure so that you can help others build the same way. Or that is what my grandfather would have done. That is what anyone should do when they know something useful that other people need." Reedy nodded. "I expect you will have a lot of visitors in the coming weeks, Miss Harlan. People asking questions." "I expect I will," she said. "I have time to answer them." Within 3 weeks of the fire, Martha Harlan had received visits from 23 separate parties, requesting information about her construction methods. She answered every question with the same patience and precision she had applied to the construction itself, drawing diagrams in the dirt, explaining the physics of thermal mass, describing the sources and proportions of her caliche mortar, and allowing visitors to take measurements of her walls with their own instruments. She did not charge for this information. While she did not demand credit or acknowledgement, she simply shared what she knew because sharing knowledge that could save lives was not optional, it was obligatory. By the end of August 1891, construction had begun on 3 new stone buildings in Mineral Springs, following her specifications with varying degrees of accuracy. By the end of 1892, that number had grown to 11, including a new general store that Thomas Reedy built with walls 18 inches thick and a floor 12 inches below grade. The Reedy store stood on Main Street for 67 years until it was demolished in 1959 to make way for a modern concrete block structure that cost 40 times as much and required air conditioning to remain habitable. The demolition crew noted that the original stone walls were still perfectly sound and had to be broken apart with jackhammers, and that the mortar joints were harder than the surrounding stone, a result of the cactus juice binding agent that Martha had learned from Pueblo techniques, and that modern material science would not fully understand for another half-century. If you have found this account valuable, if these histories of adaptive thinking and practical wisdom speak to something you recognize as important, I would invite you to like this video and consider subscribing to this channel. I make no promises about frequency or topics, only that every story I tell is researched with the same care Martha Harlan applied to her calculations. Specific dates, specific measurements, specific outcomes that prove or disprove the theories they tested. The frontier did not care about opinions. It cared about what worked, and what worked deserves to be remembered. Martha Harlan lived in her stone cabin for 12 years, until 1903, when she married a mining engineer named David Coulter and moved with him to Prescott to raise their 4 children. She sold the cabin and the surrounding claim to a rancher named Howard Beam for $700, more than double her construction cost, a return on investment that any businessman would have envied. The cabin continued to serve as a dwelling until 1934, when it was converted to a storage building for the ranch that had grown up around it. It stood through every summer for 43 years, maintaining interior temperatures that consistently ran 25 to 35 degrees below exterior highs without any mechanical cooling, a performance that would be considered exceptional even by modern passive cooling standards. The ranchers who used it for storage noticed that vegetables kept in the building lasted twice as long as those stored in their frame structures, and that the space was pleasant to work in, even on the hottest days. They did not know the history. They did not know that the building had been designed by an 18-year-old girl working from her grandfather's memories and her own calculations. They simply knew that it worked, and that was enough. Martha Harlan Coulter died in 1961 at age 88. In the same year that Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, and the modern environmental movement began asking questions about how to build sustainably in challenging climates. Her obituary in the Prescott Courier mentioned her husband, her children, her grandchildren, her charitable work with the Arizona Historical Society, and her reputation as a practical woman with a gift for solving problems. It did not mention the stone cabin. It did not mention the fire. It did not mention that she had proven at 18 years old principles of passive thermal management that would become central to the sustainable architecture movement a century later. By the time she died, her innovation had become so standard in certain parts of Arizona that no one remembered it had ever been considered radical, the highest success and the deepest anonymity arriving in the same package, as they so often do for ideas that actually work. The modern relevance of Martha Harlan's work became apparent in a study published by the University of Arizona in 2019, examining historic stone and adobe structures in southern Arizona and comparing their thermal performance to contemporary construction. The researchers, who had no knowledge of Martha Harlan or her cabin, found that well-designed masonry structures with sufficient thermal mass consistently outperformed modern frame buildings in summer cooling loads, requiring 60 to 78% less energy to maintain comfortable interior temperatures. When the physics Martha had understood intuitively, explained to her by her grandfather in language a child could grasp, had been validated by peer-reviewed research using instruments she could never have imagined: thermal mass works, ground-coupled cooling works, radiant heat management through wall thickness, and window placement works. These are not folk wisdom or frontier superstition. They are physics, and physics does not expire. The researchers noted that modern building codes, designed primarily for climates with heating rather than cooling challenges, had inadvertently discouraged the very techniques that perform best in desert environments. Regulations requiring specific insulation values, for example, while assumed that preventing heat transfer was always desirable, but in a climate where nighttime temperatures drop below daytime temperatures by 40 degrees or more, the ability to absorb daytime heat and release it at night was not a liability, but an advantage. Martha Harlan had understood this in 1891. Building scientists rediscovered it in 2019. In the intervening 128 years, countless buildings had been constructed with methods that worked against the climate rather than with it, requiring mechanical cooling that consumed energy, cost money, and failed precisely when it was needed most, during heat waves and power outages. The principles that kept Martha Harlan alive during the Copper Ridge Fire, that maintained 71-degree interior temperatures while the world burned at 111 degrees, that proved every skeptic in Mineral Springs wrong, are available to anyone willing to learn them. They do not require advanced degrees or specialized equipment. They require understanding heat, understanding mass, understanding time, and being willing to do the calculations rather than accepting the assumptions. That is what Martha Harlan did at 18, thrown out of her family home with $11.40. Armed with nothing but knowledge and determination. The cabin she built cost $300 in 1891 money, approximately $9,000 adjusted for inflation. It outperformed every other structure in the territory during the worst fire the region had experienced in 2 decades. It remained functional for over 4 decades without modification, and it proved, in the only way the frontier accepted proof, and that unconventional thinking backed by rigorous analysis produces results that conventional wisdom cannot match. The skeptics who mocked her were not stupid or malicious. They were experienced people applying the lessons they had learned from their own experience, lessons that happened to be incomplete, derived from different climates and different materials and different constraints. The frontier sorted truth from opinion through brutal honesty. What worked, worked. What did not, killed you. Martha Harlan's stone cabin worked. 3 people in Mineral Springs died that summer. People who had followed conventional wisdom, who had built what everyone built, who had trusted experience instead of physics. Their deaths were not Martha's fault. They were the cost of incomplete knowledge applied to extreme conditions. But and the lesson that Martha understood, that her grandfather had understood, that the Pueblo peoples had understood for 1,000 years before either of them was born, is that survival in hostile environments requires thinking clearly about first principles, not copying whatever worked adequately in average conditions. That lesson cost $300 and 4 months of labor in 1891. It cost nothing to learn today, if you were willing to pay attention. The Harlan cabin was demolished in 1978 to make way for a housing development that never materialized. The land where it stood is now covered by a solar panel installation, which is perhaps fitting. A structure designed to manage heat, replaced by a structure designed to capture it. Nothing remains of Martha's work, except photographs. On a few letters preserved in the Arizona Historical Society archives, her journal with its meticulous records of temperatures and construction details, and the buildings that copied her techniques without knowing her name. That is enough. That is more than most of us leave. The principles she proved still work in every desert climate on Earth, waiting to be applied by anyone who values physics over tradition and mathematics over opinion. The cabin that surrounded Martha Harlan's claim looked strange in 1891. A squat stone structure when everyone else built frame. A sunken floor when everyone else built on grade. Tiny windows when everyone else demanded light and views. But it stayed 70 degrees while the town burned at 105, and 70 degrees while the fire raged at 111. We and the people who had mocked her design came asking for her secrets before the ashes had cooled. That is not luck. That is not stubbornness. That is just mathematics, applied correctly, validated by conditions that care nothing for reputation or experience or gender or age, conditions that care only for what works. Martha Harlan knew what worked, and now, if you have listened, so do you.